What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today we're doing a card discussion on Sauravis, the Ancient and Ascended. Now, this card was in the first place deck profile from the UK Nationals, which had over 700 participants, and because of that, I thought it'd be a good idea to discuss whether or not this card is really worth the hype. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons, as always. So big shout out today to Jared and Silent Death. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. If you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So Sauravis is a light level 7 dragon ritual effect monster with 2600 attack, 2800 defense, and has an effect that reads as follows. You can ritual summon this card with Sprite's Blessing. During either player's turn, when your opponent activates a card or effect that targets a monster you control, you can discard this card, negate the activation. During either player's turn, when your opponent would special summon a monster or monsters, you can return this card from your field to the hand, negate the special summon, and if you do, banish that monster. So, this may look like a lot, but we're going to go ahead and simplify this tremendously by axing the first and third parts of the effect, because the only reason you are going to play Sauravis is for the second effect, the protection from targeting. We're never going to be summoning this. I guess if you're playing maybe some like Herald Saphira build, maybe there's a place for this card, but realistically, if you're playing this on a competitive level, you're going for that second effect, because that protection from targeting can actually be pretty good depending on the circumstances. Now, in the first place deck profile from the UK National, this card was very instrumental in helping set up the plays that the player piloting the deck essentially wanted to use it for. So the targeting protection is very valuable if your deck is able to essentially summon a boss monster, or let's say a floodgate type monster, that's really gonna lock your opponent out from being able to play the game. In this instance, it was Naturia Beast, with also Vanity's Fiend in the side if they were going into a Goki matchup. But Naturia Beast was obviously going to be for Sky Striker Trickstar, as well as pure Sky Striker. So he had some options for what he could be protecting with that Sauravis. I guess by extension, since he was playing Burning Abyss, he could also protect something like the Beatrice, but depending on what the card it's being targeted with, it might not necessarily matter. So the whole purpose here is that while Naturia Beast or Vanity's Fiend is face up on the field, yes, they are basically locking your opponent out of being able to use, 70 to 80% of their deck. It's kind of like in chess, when you check your opponent, you're putting them in a very awkward position and they have to play a certain way if they want to play out of it. And these cards are very good at doing that, but Sauravis is good because it kind of allows you to check the boxes in terms of protection from what these cards might not necessarily be protected from. In the instance of Naturia Beast, maybe from monster effects, or maybe from Vanity's Fiend, maybe from spell effects. So kind of having Sauravis to ensure you that you're not going to lose that monster to some random targeting effect seems pretty good. So what are the targeting effects that you're going to use Sauravis for in most instances? Well, let's take a look at the current meta and see what exactly we're dealing with. So since Sky Striker Trickstar and I guess pure Sky Striker by extension are arguably the top decks, let's take a look at what cards they have that target. Well, the two that come to mind right off the bat are Afterburner as well as Widow Anchor. Now, these are two extremely good cards, and a lot of times if your opponent's going to Widow Anchor one of your monsters, you might be getting OTK'd, but best case scenario for them, they're going to be able to link off with it, and you're not going to get it. So that's pretty bad, especially in the instance of something like Vanity's Fiend, or maybe even something like the Beatrice in the instance of the Burning Abyss player. That's not exactly something you really want to happen. Now, Afterburner, on the other hand, is a bit of a, polarized mix, because yes, you might not want one of your monsters to get destroyed, but we're in 2018, and having your monster getting destroyed is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. So many monsters now recur themselves or replace themselves with another card coming out of the deck, so it's not like the worst thing to have your monster get destroyed. But let's say you have a monster, say for instance like Vanity's Fiend, and it's locking your opponent down, well, that's going to be something good good that's going to protect you. But there are some other cards that I think are going to be more applicable in this particular instance. And then you also have the Link monsters. I mean, we've got stuff like Nightmare Cerberus, Nightmare Unicorn. I mean, Firewall Dragon targets with its effect. So these are three of the most universally generic Link monsters at our disposal. They target, and pretty much every extra deck's going to be running them because they are that good. So having a card like Sauravis that can offer protection against these cards is pretty good. I mean, being able to just not have your monsters be destroyed, being spun back to the deck or bounce back to your hand respectively for each of these monsters, I think has its advantages in and of itself. But then I think the biggest cards that we're going to be looking at for Sauravis to counter, but also to compare to at the same time, are Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler. Now, both Impermanence and Effect Veiler do target, so Sauravis will be able to counteract them. And that's one of the big things here. Going back to the Naturia Beast and Vanity's Fiend examples, Infinite Impermanence is one card that can out both of these boss monsters, and it's one of those cards that a lot of people are playing because it doesn't lose to Called by the Grave. There's just a lot of really strong advantages to having a card like Impermanence either in your main or side deck. Well, Sauravis kind of helps curve out having as much protection as possible because, yeah, sure, you might lock out 80% of their deck with a Vanity's Fiend or a Naturia Beast, but then Sauravis is going to cover the Impermanence, which means they're going to use the Impermanence, you're going to chain your Sauravis, you both lose a card, but guess what? You still have that boss monster that's just going to be locking them out of everything, and you're going to be in the power position. And that might be their only out, unless they drew multiple copies or have another card that's going to be able to out them in that particular instance. You know, Sauravis might have just done its job, and that might have been good enough. But one of the things here is a lot of people might question, well, if I'm going to play Sauravis, why wouldn't I just play Impermanence or Veiler instead? Because take, for instance, something like Nightmare Unicorn. Well, if your opponent summons Nightmare Unicorn, activates the effect, and targets one of your monsters, if you have Sauravis, you can discard it in response to protect your monster, or if you have Veiler, you can discard it to negate the Unicorn, or if you have Impermanence, you can flip it up to negate the Unicorn. So pretty much in all those instances, they all do the same thing, but where you start to examine and go a little bit deeper is what these cards do differently. Sauravis is very interesting because Sauravis is protecting your cards from targeting effects. And notice that it's targeting effects of cards that it doesn't specify it has to be monster, spell, or trap. And that gives it a much wider reach because let's say you have a monster. Well, that means it can be protected from a Unicorn, it can be protected from an Afterburner, a Widow Anchor, or an Impermanence. I mean, it covers monster, spell, and trap, which gives it a pretty good range. But one of the issues is it has to interact with your own cards and requires you to have a monster. By comparison, Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence don't have that same restriction because your opponent could just be completely going off using cards that interact with themselves, and having a card like Veiler, while yes, can negate something like Unicorn, same thing for Impermanence, but it can also stop them from advancing their plays, and that's what might make a card like Veiler or Impermanence look a lot more appealing because it's not reliant on you having a monster for it to be good. And that's the thing, going second, Sauravis doesn't do anything at all because you're not going to have a monster on the field, whereas Impermanence or Effect Veiler, you can actually stop your opponent from progressing with their plays, possibly slow them down, and have the opportunity to establish yourself. So these are definitely things you have to keep in mind because I think one of the biggest weaknesses of Sauravis is the dependency it has on basically interacting with your own cards, but your opponent interacting with your cards, specifically with targeting based effects. So that's where we're going to get into the cons section of this video, and unfortunately for Sauravis, it does have a lot of downsides. I mean, first off, it's going to be a -1 in most instances because it just negates the activations of effects. You know, it has the ability in its summon effect that it can be banishing cards. Why couldn't they put that on the hand trap effect? Well, maybe that'd be a little bit too busted, but in those instances where your opponent has like a Unicorn and then you use Sauravis to protect your monster, sure, your monster's still protected, but they still have that Unicorn, and that's really bad because that's a Link 3 monster that they can use to potentially rank up into a Link 4 or maybe down into a Link 2 or have the fodder to realistically do whatever they want with that Unicorn. It's not removing any threat from the field. field, you just protected your monster from one single activation. The second thing is that, this card doesn't do anything by itself. We've already reiterated this a couple times, but the fact that it's dependent on you having cards, or specifically monsters in this case, and the fact that it has to specifically protect monsters. I wish it was a little bit broader and that it could protect any of your cards from being targeted. That way it could maybe protect like your pendulum scales or spells and traps or field spells. I think that'd give it a lot more flexibility, but unfortunately it has to be a monster, and I think that really takes away from the potential that this card could really have. And last but not least, I think one of the cards that you might want to compare Sauravis to is a card like Nightmare Goblin, because when you hear protection from targeting, Nightmare Goblin is going to be a card that a lot of people gravitate towards. Well, what are the strengths of Nightmare Goblin compared to Sauravis? Well, Nightmare Goblin, it's in the extra deck, which is really good, because by doing so, you don't have to hard draw the Sauravis and then establish a monster that's worth protecting with that Sauravis. I mean, Goblin's in your extra deck, so at any point, if you want to make a link to and possibly link off with some of your other monsters to co-link to establish the protection from targeting, then you're going to be in a really good position, and I think that's a lot more consistent than hoping to just hard draw a card that you might be playing in your deck that you're realistically not going to be searching out through any other means. The other thing is that Nightmare Goblin's actually a monster on the field. I mean, you can't summon Sauravis whatsoever. I mean, it's a ritual monster. You're not going to play the ritual spell. It's level 7. Like, at least with hand traps like Effect Veiler, if you're in such a desperate situation that you need to protect your life points, you can at least set Effect Veiler, and that's pretty good, and sometimes maybe you can top deck into something else, and that's going to be good enough. But Sauravis is the absolute worst top deck you can possibly have, especially if you're behind in the game, because the card's not going to do anything for you, and then you're just going to be wondering why you played the card in the first place. But the third and final thing about Goblin that makes it very appealing, yeah, sure, it does require you to play Link monsters, whereas Sauravis can kind of protect boss monsters like, again, Naturia Beast, Vanity's Fiend, any Floodgate monster in particular is where this card really shines. The thing is, though, Nightmare Goblin has an extra effect, and it doesn't have to be solely relegated to protection from targeting. You can normal summon in additional time with Goblin, and that's what a lot of people are going to be using it for. But if you just so happen to want to give all your co-linked monsters protection from targeting, you're going to be able to do that, and with link summoning becoming as common as it is now, and co-linking several monsters in a row not really being too difficult, it just makes a card like Nightmare Goblin, by comparison, look a lot better because it's more flexible, it's in the extra deck, meaning it's more accessible, and Sauravis is just kind of slowly being susceptible to power creep and just not really becoming that relevant of a card. I think for what it is, Sauravis is okay, and I think in the instance of the winner of the UK National, I think it did its job, because Naturia Beast is such a blowout in this format, I guess for Vanity's Fiend against your Goki matchup as well, if you draw the Naturia Beast, or rather, you summon the Naturia Beast or draw the Vanity's Fiend and have Sauravis in hand with it, you're probably going to win that game if you're going first. But it's one of those things where you're really just hindering the consistency of your deck just to play this card, and that's something you guys really have to think about as to whether or not it's worth it. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Sauravis. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.